In this lesson, what we're going to do is take an introduction to the state and condition of Russia at the point at which Tsar Nicholas II takes the throne. This means looking at the Russian Empire in the year of 1894. And what we're going to do is talk specifically about the socio-economic conditions that existed at this time. So we're going to talk about the impact of industrialization, the impact that that had on not only the economic conditions of Russia, but also the social conditions of Russia and the growth and development of Russian cities, as well as other factors at the same time. So at the end of the 1800s, we see very large developments in the industrialization of Russia. Industrialization takes place from around the mid 1700s all the way through to the 1900s, the 20th century in most of Europe. And just like with every other kind of economic and social development that takes place in Europe, Russia is very slow to pick up on that trend. And so towards the end of the 1800s, we start to see major developments in industrialization. We can example this by looking at the production of oil and coal, the production of iron, which increased threefold and fourfold collectively. And the partial reason for this huge growth in industrialization within the Russian Empire is due to the senior minister, who was Sergei Witt, who introduced pro-industrialization policies. So this policy towards a more favorable outlook on industrialization led to a dramatic increase in the amount of production of raw materials and industrial materials that took place. Now, this is the economic side of the discussion in relation to industrialization, but there are also social factors that influences industrialization, and industrialization, on the other hand, influences social factors. So the growth of industrialization results in the growth of cities, because that is where we see the central hubs for a number of different industrial activities. A lot of industry takes place within the context of the urban environment, in the context of cities. Now, the result of this would be us seeing many Russians from rural areas, from agricultural working environments, move into the cities to find work in these new areas, in these new industries, should I say. So, for example, cities like Moscow and cities like St. Petersburg would grow in terms of their size and in terms of the number of people living in said cities as a result of the growth in industrialization. So all of these factors would feed and play into each other towards the end of the 1800s and result in a massive growth and a massive boom in industrialization within the Russian Empire. We also highlight here the city of St. Petersburg because it's very important due to the fact that this is where we see the location of the Tsar's Winter Palace. In fact, St. Petersburg is the traditional capital of the Russian Empire, considering that that is where Peter the Great founded his own city, described as the Venice of the North, and proclaimed it the capital of his empire. So that's why St. Petersburg is so important and influential. St. Petersburg would be renamed to Leningrad during the time of the Soviet Union, and then it would change back to St. Petersburg towards at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So given that industrialization led to the growth of these cities, and given the fact that all of these individuals from the rural areas of the Russian Empire moved into the cities and to work and to live and to work in these industries, it's important that we look at the working conditions in the Russian cities, the living and working conditions. Now, despite the fact that we see a massive increase in industrial output, and in terms of production, the living and working conditions in these cities were incredibly poor. So one of the major issues that was had was the fact that because of the population growth in these cities, we see the issue of overcrowding. Essentially, the growth in the population was outpacing the growth in the cities. So the cities weren't able to keep up with the amount of people that were being flooded into the city in terms of working and living there. And as such, that would mean that people would become overcrowded in said cities. But not only was it just generally overcrowded in a lot of these industrial cities, but government regulation on employment rights didn't exist in the Russian Empire. So things like working hours, things like rules for child participation in labor practices, as well as just general conditions more broadly, were very, very poor. There was no regulation to ensure that there was a minimum standard of protection for example, working too many hours, or for example, a certain minimum age at which you can work, and also the practices and conditions of the kinds of jobs that these people were doing. So poor working conditions and regulation led to the fact that we have an outlawing of trade unions. So there was no method by which workers were able to unionize and work collectively to bargain for better working conditions, which is what a trade union exists to do. The pay was incredibly low. There was no minimum wage of any kind in this particular environment. And workers were forced to work for up to 12 hours per day. So there was no limitation on the amount of hours that they had to do in order to make a living. So we see that, of course, living and working conditions is very, very, very poor. Conditions themselves were very, very dangerous. There weren't particularly any safety regulations in terms of the ability for people to avoid death and injury at work. And because, of course, we are talking about quite heavy industries, so we're talking about oil, coal, iron production, it's, of course, quite dangerous activities, quite labor-intensive and quite dangerous activities. We're not talking about working, for example, in an office. We're talking about quite conditions that can be conducive to a lot of injury and a lot of death. So given the fact that industrialization grows at the end of the 1800s, and given the fact that this leads to a growth in the cities, and this leads to a certain degree of very poor working conditions, what was the impact of industrialization more broadly on Russian society? Well, essentially, industrialization would bring new wealth into the region. It would result in the change of a class structure in the Russian Empire, something that is particularly detrimental, as we will see in the future when we start to talk about the ideology behind the Russian Revolution. So before major industrialization, the Russian middle class, so the relatively affluent but not, of course, aristocratic part of Russian society, was relatively small. Now, with the introduction of this new industrial growth and economic growth through industry, we see a growth of a new capitalist class. So we see an increase in industrialists, we see an increase in bankers, in businessmen, and in landowners. And this major divide would play a very key role in the build-up to the Russian Revolution in 1917, as we will see in future lessons. So before we get to the facts of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution and the February Revolution, we'll talk about some of the ideological motivations and sort of the ideological impact of the revolution itself, because essentially, these new major changes in the class structure and the wealth structure within Russian society would play a very key role in the build-up to the Russian Revolution.